Hello again, everybody, and welcome back to the Winter Speakers Seminar series on international human rights and their work abroad. Tonight, we are looking at the specific role of faith-based human rights organisations. What do they bring to human rights work abroad that is different from secular or issue-driven human rights organisations or philanthropic organisations? And afterwards, there's going to be a Q&A with our guest speaker from a Stanford student. Let me tell you a little bit about our speaker and then our Stanford student interlocutor. Mark Lorey has worked with World Vision for more than 10 years, initially as Director of the Models of Learning HIV/AIDS Education Program, and currently is Vice President for Child Development and Program Effectiveness. The group that he leads provides global technical leadership for World Vision's work in education, child protection, child participation, gender, disability, peace building, urban planning, local partnering and advocacy, and other technical work. Mark graduated from Duke, and after graduating in 1995, he then went as a Duke University Hark Fellow to the Malawi Field Office of Save the Children, where he worked with the COPE program. Maybe you'll tell us what COPE stands for, Mark, to strengthen community capacity to care for people suffering from HIV and AIDS. Now, you'll recollect that the week before last, we had the CEO of Save the Children, and it's a prodigiously secular organisation, I think we can say. There was no mention of religion. After his Hart Fellowship, Mark worked as staff in the Malawi office until beginning service as a Rotary Scholar in South Africa, where he pursued a master's degree at the University of Western Cape. If anybody here has done Stanford abroad in South Africa, you know that University of Western Cape is a coloured university. He became a visiting lecturer and researcher there in the university's Institute for Social Development, and also worked with the South African Office of the Deputy President on an international comparative study examining policy coordination at the cabinet level. In 1999, Mark returned to the US and consulted for organisations including Save the Children, USAID, that's the United States major aid granting agency based in DC, and a foundation focused on children orphaned by AIDS. Acting as his interlocutor tonight is Nicole Richards, who I first met as a freshman, now nearly 4 years ago. Nicole's class of 2016, so 3 years ago, I suppose. And you may have seen Nicole on the Program on Human Rights website when she was just last October named as one of 15 most impressive students at Stanford by Business Insider. Nicole grew up in Vienna and lived around the world with her parents in different places, and started whilst she was in high school working with women who'd been and girls who'd been subjected to abuse. And when she came to Stanford, was very clear in her own mind that she was going to work on the issue of women and especially human trafficking. In her first year, she applied for a Program on Human Rights and Ethics in Society Summer Human Rights Fellowship, and at that time was one of the first 2 students I'd ever given a fellowship to a freshman, and then went off to Guatemala, where she worked on a child rescue and advocacy group called Kids Alive. And it's out of that work that Nicole went on to develop a micro business program for young girls who are victims of sex trafficking and sexual abuse. Nicole has continued to work on the issue of human trafficking. She took the Winter Speaker Series several years ago that was on just trafficking. She has worked as my research assistant, looking at especially the funding of US and international not-for-profits in the human trafficking field. She was also RAing and TAing on the first group of 4 faculty members here at Stanford when we started the first course here on human trafficking now 3 years ago. And I've asked Nicole here tonight because I've watched her over the last 3 years or so change her perspective quite a bit. I'm not going to say what it was, and I'm not going to say what it is. I'm going to leave that up to her. But it struck me that she's the ideal person to be having the conversation with Mark tonight. And that ends my role. I'll wave you all off at 7 o'clock, but now it's over to Mark, and then it's over to Mark and Nicole. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you very much, Ellen. Good evening. Thank you very much for the opportunity to join you tonight. Helen, I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you, and Nicole, looking forward to our discussion soon. Sincere thanks to the Program for Human Rights for opening up this whole speaker series. It really is a privilege to have a chance to talk with some of the brightest folks in America and in the world. Can I just ask to try to be able to tailor what I share a little bit more to the group gathered? Can you raise your hand if you're an undergraduate? Good, okay, the vast majority. And then could you raise your hand if you're a graduate student, please? Great. And anyone who doesn't fit in either category? Please, if you could share a little bit about your background or interest.
I am director of a new think tank in Palo Alto, and I've done some work professionally with World Vision's work in Muslim-Christian relations.
Brilliant, welcome. And back to the back there. Anyone else, yourself?
I am a visiting scholar at FSI, and I'm a graduate of Stanford about 10 years ago. I'm a professor of political science and international relations at the University of Georgia.
Great, great. I grew up in Atlanta. Good to have somebody with a Georgia connection. And sir?
From the community of art.
Good. All right. Well, I appreciate everyone sharing the time this evening. I'd like to share just a few things as we go through about half an hour together. I want to keep what I share pretty limited and really open up as much space as possible for discussion together, for any questions or any suggestions, any thoughts that you'd like to share. I'm going to give a brief introduction to World Vision, who we are, what we do. Then I'll be speaking about 3 examples of ways in which we've contributed towards advancing human rights, or at least tried to. And then we'll share a little bit about my own journey towards this work, starting with human rights as a passion when I was a kind of late teenager, and talk about how that led me a bit forward from there. So a little bit about World Vision. Can I ask how many folks have heard of World Vision prior to now? Most folks, okay. We are at work in about 100 countries around the world. That varies a bit depending on where emergencies occur. So we recently established a presence in northern Iraq. They come and go a bit. And we seek to serve all people, regardless of race, ethnicity, religion, gender, or sexual orientation. We are Christian, child-focused, and community-based. We seek for all of our work to reflect those 3 distinctives. And I'm glad to talk through a bit more now and in our discussion time about what that means. Our goal, anywhere and everywhere that we work, across the spectrum from our emergency response to our long-term development to our advocacy work, is the sustained well-being of children within families and communities, especially those children who are most vulnerable. And our priorities for child well-being, what we seek to focus on in improving children's lives, together with partners and communities, are that girls and boys have adequate nutrition, that they are protected from disease and infection, that they are equipped with literacy and numeracy and life skills, and that they are cared for, protected, and participating actively in their families, in their communities, in their society as a whole. This is a nice, simple diagram. It just shows how streamlined and straightforward our organization is. We are a partnership, a federation. If anybody is kind of org wonk a bit like me, then I'd be happy to talk about that further during the Q&A time. But we have 18 what we call support offices. They are offices in various countries around the world, including this one, that have a primary role of raising resources and also engage in advocacy in their context. And then we have about 75 national offices, as they're called. Those are offices that are implementing programs. Some of them are also raising funds within their own context, quite a few of those progressing, so that over time they actually will export funds they raise. And that's one of the major trends we see we're very encouraged by in the humanitarian landscape globally right now. And a lot of countries that were previously aid recipients are now becoming aid providers over time. And the best example for us is Korea, which is where World Vision started and which now is one of our largest and fastest growing support offices. And then finally, the regional offices, the national offices are clustered within those, and the global center, the rather immodestly and unfortunately named kind of coordinating group that I'm a part of, and others as well, trying to provide global leadership for our work in our about 45,000 staff around the world. A little bit about World Vision and human rights. We have endorsed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and a number of other instruments and protocols. And I won't read the text fully there, but it gives you a bit of a sense of how we see our faith commitment as Christians as very much in line with, supportive of, and enabling the realization of human rights in many contexts around the world. So I'd like to share about 3 examples of ways we've sought to contribute towards advancing the well-being of children, working with communities and partners, and seeking to enhance respect for human rights in various ways. The first is one that was closely involved in and helped to start something called the HOPE Initiative, which was an organization-wide effort to respond to the impacts of HIV and AIDS, particularly in Southern and East Africa in the late 90s and the early 2000s. At that time, as many of you know, HIV was spreading very rapidly across a number of country contexts. ARVs were barely on the horizon, only for a privileged few, and more adults were falling ill and passing away. More and more children were being left behind, and development gains of the past 15, 20 years were being eroded rapidly. So fortunately, a few folks within World Vision, prior to my joining, I realized this was one of the fundamental challenges facing humanity, the human family, and certainly children. We needed to be doing more. And it was really one of the first times we've made a kind of whole organization effort and marched a bit off the map, out of our comfort zone, since in those days HIV was strongly associated with groups that many Christians around the world, including those in America, were not very comfortable talking about, with injecting drug users, with homosexuals, with others that were seen as out there, as other, those who might have been unfaithful or done questionable things. And we were able to overcome some of the resistance in order to really launch an effort to respond effectively. And we had a kind of 3-part focus on prevention, care, and advocacy, with strong emphasis on children. And we used 2 main approaches. One was called Channels of Hope, and a couple of minutes I'm going to share a little video about Channels of Hope to give you a bit more of a sense of that. It was a methodology for working to mobilize church leaders and other faith leaders, particularly from Muslim communities of faith, to play a leadership role in helping their congregations and their communities address HIV and the impacts of AIDS. It was unusual at the time to see the faith community as an ally rather than an obstacle. We felt it was necessary, given, and we'll probably touch on this a bit more in our discussion, the importance of faith communities around the world, particularly in Africa, but also in most parts of the world. There are arguably more faith communities than perhaps any other expression of civil society. And in most communities, their leaders are respected and have voices that carry quite a lot of weight. Not all, needless to say, there are plenty of exceptions, but generally very influential. So key allies, key partners, if you can overcome some of the perceptions of people who are living with HIV as other, as different, as somehow wrong or even sinful. If you can overcome the stigma and the ensuing discrimination that flows from that. So that was what Channels of Hope was all about. And you'll hear a bit more about that in a moment. And following on from that, once people's minds and hearts are changed, as we saw time and time again very powerfully, and the question is, what do you do next? And that's where the community care coalitions come in. idea is very basic. It's good community development. It's bringing together the right people who are committed and want to do something, or should be, bringing them together to focus on a common need. In this case, more and more orphans who are being left behind, more and more children being made vulnerable. We found that very few things are as compelling to bring people together as the needs of children. Thankfully, I think it reaches almost all of us pretty deeply within. And bringing together then faith leaders, people from the private sector, from local businesses, the government staff who would need to be involved, other people of goodwill, bringing them together to focus on providing care for people living with HIV, otherwise chronically ill, for orphans or other vulnerable children, and also to promote prevention through that. That was the basic idea of the community care coalitions. And it gives you a little bit of a sense of the scale. Once we tested those two approaches and were able to refine them based on the learning, we were able to scale them across most of the countries where we work in Southern East Africa, and began to share it, to scale them in some other parts of the world as well. And this gives you a little bit of a sense of the reach, and more than 366,000 faith leaders thus far reached through Channels of Hope workshops. That includes Channels of Hope for HIV and AIDS. But over time, we've also adapted it to address other challenges and concerns. We have a Channels of Hope focused on child protection, looking at exploitation, abuse, and neglect issues in a particular community contexts. We also have a Channels of Hope for gender, seeking to build gender equality and transform relationships between women and men, girls and boys, and address some of those underlying sources of inequity and discrimination. So, and with the community care coalitions, see, we were ultimately able to reach more than 1 million orphans and vulnerable children through a good number of community care coalitions, and the home visitors who are volunteers within those who would agree to make regular visits to the homes of people living with HIV, orphans, and vulnerable children as well. Provide encouragement, support. The technical term might be psychosocial support, and it's really just offering a listening ear, a caring heart, and also often material assistance. It's amazing how much difference a bar of soap can make. That can be the difference between a child going to school and not going to school, because she can wash once a week in order to be allowed to go to school. Those kind of small but really significant things are what many of these home visitors brought day in and day out. Let's see if this one will work now.
The shadow cast by AIDS since the HIV virus was identified nearly 30 years ago has extended into every nation, culture, and society on the planet. It's left millions dead, millions more abandoned, and countless families, communities, and hearts broken. Antiretroviral drugs and other scientific breakthroughs have given people hope of longer, more productive lives. But there's no vaccine against the fear and stigma, judgment, and rejection faced by the infected. This is where the human touch, and for people of faith, the presence of God is needed. Yet faith communities have been slow to respond and often quick to judge and condemn. That's what two faith leaders from widely divergent contexts found. One an Armenian Orthodox priest and the other a Kenyan sheikh. One discovered it among fellow believers. The other found it lodged deep within his own heart and basic beliefs. Sheikh Hassan Omari, the leader of a mosque in Nairobi, was shocked by the wrath and rejection of his congregants when he proposed that people with HIV and AIDS should not be condemned. He was accused of supporting prostitution. Father Javand, an Orthodox priest in Armenia, was aggressively intolerant of people living with HIV. He believed their disease was a sign of God's judgment and condemnation, and that they should be despised. Then, each man encountered channels of hope, which would transform their ministries and their lives. Channels of Hope was created by CABSA, the Christian AIDS Bureau for Southern Africa. World Vision, a global Christian relief, development, and advocacy agency, adapted and expanded this approach, first with pastors, then to a broader scope of Christian traditions around the world. Muslims joined the movement when the Mufti of Zambia asked World Vision to adapt it to their faith. Channels of Hope was a natural fit with World Vision's fourfold response to HIV and AIDS: training and equipping caregivers,
How can we prevent AIDS?
promoting prevention with children, youth, and adults, providing support to those living with HIV and AIDS, and caring for the orphans and vulnerable children left behind. But none of these things can be accomplished if people and their communities are frozen by fear, lack of knowledge, and prejudice. Channels of Hope equips faith leaders to overcome these obstacles, mobilizing communities to support and link patients to proper medical care and ART therapy. At a typical Channels of Hope workshop, Christian and Muslim leaders separately work through guiding principles from their own scriptures. Next, they come together to share across faith lines. They learn about the realities of AIDS, combating fears, myths, and prejudices, understanding the need for comprehensive prevention. Sheikh Hassan returned to his mosque with a new way of speaking about HIV and AIDS. Now, people confide in him about their status and seek his help and guidance. Muslim women are reaching out to care for people infected and affected by HIV and AIDS. Sheikhs and imams talk openly in mosques, breaking the deadly silence that causes many to hide their infection and suffer alone. Father Javand had a profound change of heart and a radical transformation of his ministry. He's now a compassionate and outspoken faith leader combating the stigma of AIDS. He serves people living with HIV in 35 communities. He's trained teachers, health providers, parents, and nearly 10,000 children, mobilizing them to spread the message of acceptance, prevention, and hope. Channels of Hope is continuously being enriched by new participants: churches, mosques, community leaders, local businesses, NGOs, international agencies, and government at all levels. Nearly 17,000 Channels of Hope workshops have been conducted worldwide with more than 400,000 participants. More than 110,000 pastors, priests, sheikhs, and imams have been trained. Faith leaders have mobilized 46,000 congregation-based volunteers in Africa alone. These volunteer caregivers play a crucial role, ensuring home-based care, outpatient case management, promoting testing, and counseling at-risk pregnant women and mothers of newborns. And the Channels of Hope approach is expanding to address maternal and child health, gender, and child protection, bringing faith leaders and communities together to influence positive behavior change for the well-being of children. Each faith has its own dictates about caring for others. Channels of Hope is about working together to love God and our neighbor, enriching each other's efforts, living out our golden rules, bringing hope and relief from suffering to men, women, and children.
All right. One last thought on this one before we shift to another topic, and that's a little bit about the advocacy side here in the U.S. Many of you will remember in the early 2000s that HIV was not very much on the radar screen, or if it was, that it was seen as one other disease out there and pretty far away from many folks. But then, thanks to a lot of activism, commitment from a lot of different quarters, there was a growing recognition of the severity of the threat that HIV posed. And we were pleased to be part of that, particularly working with Christian communities here in the U.S. To help overcome stigma, discrimination, incorrect understandings and assumptions about who is living with HIV, to help draw on compassion, and I think really help create the seedbed, along with a number of other partners, for what emerged as PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, coming from a rather unlikely administration. Not many folks would have expected in the early 2000s that the Bush administration would end up leading a global charge together with the 3x5 initiative, the WHO and other agencies to really expand ARV access and to help people who are living with HIV to live long and healthy lives. So another effort that was combined with those on the ground to try to make lasting change. All right, the second example, and I'll spend less time on this and even less on the third, is to give you a little bit of a sense of another area of workforce that's really emerging rapidly is called citizen voice in action. It's the particular approach that we use to enabling social accountability, essentially to help communities hold their local governments accountable for the commitments that their government has made to communities in terms of services, products, other things that are on paper but often not in reality. This is done through really a constructive rather than a confrontational approach. As generally, we find that those folks who are on the ground, those local government folks, they may be teachers, they may be district education officials, they may be workers in a clinic, or they may be the district health team. They generally want to see services provided and the resources available that they need as well, but they have obstacles or bottlenecks further up the chain. So we're able to work together with them to overcome those obstacles and to ensure these obligations are fulfilled so that real improvements in service, particularly for us as a child-focused organization for children, can occur. A little bit about how this works. First, we work together with communities to equip them with some basic understanding of what those entitlements are, what the government is committed to already, and to talk with them about how best to engage with local government. That's the box there at the top. And then on the right-hand side, there's a community gathering. Again, a constructive gathering with local government staff, the appropriate folks, to talk through what is the current situation, how does that compare with what's on paper, what should be, and then to talk through what's the action plan? How do we move forward in addressing this together? And that leads, in most cases, to improving services, and more we're seeking to link that from the local level to the national level to help improve policy as well. Show you just a couple of example scorecards, give you a sense of what's actually done. It's very concrete. So you'll see here in the first column, these are this is a particular place in Zambia I've spent some time called Kembe, where they have the things that are supposed to be at a clinic in terms of the midwife, the ORS availability, the vaccines, and then the next column, what the standard is, the next column, what is actually in place in reality, and then any comments in relation to that. And you see something similar in terms of community ranking their satisfaction with the level of service provided. It sounds pretty pedestrian, but it unleashes remarkable change when service providers have a chance to see feedback from the community and realize, oh, we've actually got to up our game. We've got to take this a little more seriously. Seeing just dramatic transformation and improvement that results in real improvements in children's lives. And fortunately for this approach, we have some very strong evidence of effectiveness. A randomized control trial that was done in Uganda in 2009 using a methodology like CVA. It just shows some particular health outcomes that are quite striking. A 33% drop, 1/3 cut in child mortality over the course of just a year. Projecting that out, that were done, extended to 10 NO's national offices in our zoo of acronyms, then 76,000 child deaths could be averted. Pretty powerful stuff. And you see other significant increases there at reasonable cost, only about $300 per death averted. Doesn't get much more cost effective than that, and those results were sustained over time. Another study, it was on education outcomes, also in Uganda, looked at the use of CVA in schools and saw a number of significant improvements in pupil test scores and attendance and teacher absenteeism, reducing significantly at a quite reasonable cost as well. And the last point there, a standardized scorecard, it was compared and had no significant impact. So when you come in with a scorecard from outside and say this is what you're going to rank the schools on, it didn't make much of a difference. But when community members themselves generate that scorecard and then apply it and then share those results with the service providers, it's actually very powerful and it leads to significant change. So we are now working to build this into our programming in health and education, in agriculture, and a number of other sectors where we work. It really is sector neutral in about 43 countries. The final example I'll share is the one with which I have the least direct experience, but wanted to give you just a sense of the scope of our work in relation to this, and closely related actually to the good work that Nicole and Helen both have done as well in terms of human trafficking. We've been involved in anti-trafficking work for more than a decade now. In our flagship work, we work in several regions. The flagship work has really been in Southeast Asia and the greater Mekong sub-region. And we have a continuation of work that has been funded for a while by Australian Aid and a number of World Vision support offices. It's focused in 6 countries, 2 which are mainly destination countries, China and Thailand, and then 4 of which are mainly source countries, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam. Though that is changing over time, as we see formerly source countries increasingly become destination countries too, as their level of wealth increases. And there are 3 pillars for our work there. I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. This just gives you a bit of a mapping of the areas where we're working for this Ending Trafficking in Persons, or ETIP program, and the 3 pillars of prevention and protection and policy. I'm fairly familiar as standard practice, I think, for good anti-trafficking programs. I think our main effort is to really link up the work that's happening on the ground with children's groups and youth groups, and with reintegration of trafficked persons, a host of other things that are happening with individuals and communities, to link that up with policy change at a national level and policy implementation as well, since we know that things on the books don't always get implemented faithfully. And we've been quite encouraged by some results in that regard, but still a very long way to go. So let me finish as I put this up. This is the vision statement for World Vision, and it resonates for many of us. Let me finish with just a little bit of my own journey into this work at the request of Helen, and I think Nicole is going to then share a little bit with us about her own journey as well. I became aware and then deeply engaged with issues around the apartheid, and through that with human rights when I was in high school, and did a few things here and there in relation to that. But it convinced me that when I went to undergrad that I was going to be a human rights lawyer. Sure, that was what I wanted to do. It took me about 4 weeks of my first semester of undergrad to realize I didn't want to be a lawyer. It just didn't appeal to me. And it left me at loose ends, because I don't know if it's still the case here at Stanford today, but in those days where I was, basically there was pre-law, pre-med, or business, and it didn't seem to be too many other options out there, and none of those really resonated with me. So it left me really kind of loose ends, and going through ultimately what proved to be the darkest time of my life, trying a number of things that just hopefully were somewhat worthwhile, but didn't really connect with me. Had a chance to work with homeless people in my hometown of Atlanta for a while, had a chance to work with migrant farm workers in North Carolina, and really respected the people that were doing that work, but it wasn't the work that really resonated with me. And then it had a truly transformative time when I had the opportunity to study abroad in Kenya. My one piece maybe of advice or suggestion tonight would be, if you have the opportunity to study abroad, by all means do so. It can be truly transformative in ways large and small. And I imagine many of you already have or are planning to already. For me, having a chance to just see the remarkable resilience and strength of people in communities was humbling and inspiring, and kind of set me on the path I'm working to follow today. I went in hoping to do something in relation to human rights. I was hoping to work with perhaps a human rights advocacy organization or an opposition political body. And this was the early 90s when Daniel Arap Moi was the president, and it was a very discouraging environment for opposition parties, should we say. Or I thought maybe I could work with a crusading journalism organization. The director of the program I was part of said, well, you know, you could do that, but then we'd probably be kicked out of the country. We've been here about 20 years, so we might want to stick around. So yeah, all right. So he linked me with an agency that he'd had good experience with previously. It was called Christian Children's Fund. Today, some of you may know it's called Child Fund. They changed their name a while back. And I had a chance to visit a number of different communities and see a number of different approaches to child-focused development work, and to, again, be just inspired by what communities were doing and how just they were willing to sacrifice oftentimes what they had for tomorrow so that their neighbors could eat today. It was extraordinary, beyond anything that I'd seen or experienced. And I've started to sense a real calling to contribute what I could to this work. So that's what led me then to come back to Africa after graduating, working with Save the Children, as Helen mentioned, and then doing some grad study and some teaching in development management, development policy, and then consultancy, and ultimately joining World Vision. It was about 13 years ago. I was based in Zambia for the first 4 years when we were starting up this HIV and AIDS work, and feel very fortunate to have been able to follow this sense of calling and to be working with a lot of very dedicated people together towards that. So I will stop there. I appreciate your energy and attention in this, and after Nicole has a chance to share some things and raise a few questions, I would really welcome any questions or suggestions or thoughts you'd like to share. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Can you guys hear me? So my name is Nicole. I'm a junior at Stanford, like Helen said, studying public policy. And I guess I'll just talk a little bit about how, I guess, my view of human rights work and of nonprofits has changed since I moved to Stanford. I, very similarly to Mark, came in wanting to be a human rights lawyer. I was really passionate about the issue of human trafficking and really thought that there was one way to address it, and that it was human rights law. I think through working with different organizations and learning a lot through my classes and just becoming more familiar with different ways of approaching problems, I realized that there's so many more ways to approach global issues than just one way of doing it the legal route. And I do think that that's still a really important aspect, but that it's one aspect of addressing a really complex problem. So I guess one way my perspective has changed is just realizing that no problem is simple enough to just address with one solution. Throughout my time at Stanford, I've also worked with some faith-based organizations and some not faith-based organizations. And I think that I came into Stanford really feeling like faith-based organizations were the only way to address global problems. And sort of through working with some and doing research for Professor Stacy on sort of funding and different things that influence policies and practices, I still think there's definitely a place for faith-based organizations, but I think it's really important to have that counterbalance of non-faith-based organizations, because I think both seeing problems and solutions from both perspectives really allows you to address accountability in both fields, I guess, and just create more holistic solutions. Well, thank you so much for being here today. I guess to get started, if you could tell us a little bit about how you see the role of faith-based organizations in contrast or working together with non-faith-based organizations.
Good. Thanks, Nicole. I think that we probably have more in common as faith-based organizations and secular organizations than that which differentiates us, with certain exceptions on either extreme end of the spectrum. The vast majority of organizations share a number of common commitments, act based on some common principles as well. And then when we get into the specific distinctives, that does vary a bit from organization to organization, depending on their focus, their faith background, their history as well. I can just speak for World Vision. What I would see is perhaps some of the distinctives in World Vision as compared to other secular organizations that I'd worked with previously. I'd say there are probably three. The first is around motivation. One of the things I've felt most fortunate about in working with World Vision is just the depth of commitment and compassion and calling that people across the organization feel. And I think that's the case in many secular organizations as well. They may frame it or phrase it differently and may not speak about calling. But I have found just almost across the board, from our frontline staff, who are the real heroes, to folks in support offices and elsewhere, a remarkable degree of commitment. And we actually do organizational benchmarking compared with various others, for-profit, nonprofit, faith-based, and otherwise. And when you look at the metrics around kind of commitment to the organization, engagement, they are remarkably high in our organization. I think in many faith-based organizations as well. People are really willing to go above and beyond, sometimes to the detriment of their own health and well-being and out of their families. But that's a challenge in many organizations to get that balance right. The second thing I would say that's a distinctive for us is a more holistic understanding of individuals and families and communities, understanding the importance of a spiritual dimension in human life, not just a Christian or a particular faith dimension. It varies depending on context and history, but the importance of spirituality and how tapping into that can enable remarkable change, genuine transformation in terms of individuals' lives, in terms of relationships within families, overcoming gender-based violence, which is so often deeply rooted in one's faith and in cultural practices, often really requires a kind of a transformation of heart and spirit, as well as a change in behavior. And in communities as well, to be able to overcome long-standing divides and divisions, having a spiritual dimension and being intentional about recognizing that and addressing that can be quite significant. And then the third and the final way I would say is that we as a faith-based organization ourselves have a particular kind of affinity and with and openness to other faith organizations, to faith communities, including at the local level. And have, I suppose, a shared experience, a bit of a common vocabulary, a capacity to connect more readily with a variety of different churches, mosques, faith organizations, generally speaking. We as World Vision are not associated with any single denomination within the Christian tradition. We are multi-denominational, and so we are able to work from Orthodox to Catholic to Protestants in various streams of Protestantism and really seek to quite actively. And we also seek to work respectfully and humbly together with people of other faith traditions as well.
Awesome. I guess kind of going off of that, you spoke a lot about how it sort of influences the motivation and I guess kind of the heart of the organization. How does World Vision, how does the faith aspect of World Vision actually play out on the ground? So like in the interactions with people, in the communities, how does faith play into that?
Our starting point whenever we begin engaging with communities and with local partners is children and the well-being of children. And our basic approach to development, we seek to first understand who is active in a community, and then to listen to them, bring together those different stakeholders, the technical term, to develop a shared vision for the well-being of children and the priorities for working towards that vision, working to accomplish those together, and then identifying who can do what towards that. And we'd always prefer to play a catalytic and capacity building kind of background role rather than a leading role if possible. Depending on the context, we generally seek to involve faith leaders very actively in those discussions, and we also do seek to, as communities articulate their vision for the well-being of children, to ask questions around all dimensions of that, including the spiritual dimension, as well as the physical and material dimensions that often are the first to come to mind.
And so when you're working with children, and maybe like children who are not from faith backgrounds themselves, how do you, or what type of consent do you guys think about in terms of like their families, or even just thinking about the fact that kids can't consent to things the way that adults can?
Yeah, and that's a critical concern for us because we are deeply committed to children's protection and children's participation. And in fact, participation is really too weak a term in many respects. We seek to empower children to have their own voices and shape their reality within their families, within their communities, even the society as a whole. And we seek first to really understand where children are, how they are currently being involved in family and community activities, and what spiritual nurture means within that context, and then to encourage kind of contextually appropriate spiritual nurture that makes sense, is healthy for those children, and builds on kind of local strengths. We don't have young children signing forms, but there is a parental consent involved, and we would never seek to impose religious views of any sort, whether from our faith tradition or others, on children or adults for that matter.
Awesome. And then I guess a little bit building off of that too, when you guys as a US-based organization with sort of the Christian tradition that comes along with that, how do you enter a new community in a completely different culture and try, maybe it's also a Christian organization that you're working with, or Christian, or people from a Christian background? How do you make sure to incorporate religious cultural differences into the decision-making process?
Good. Well, we're fortunate that 95% of our staff around the world work in their home regions, and in fact, most of them in their home countries. So in a given national office, if we have any expats at all, it's usually a small number in particular roles that are difficult to recruit for in that particular country. And our staff often have different faith backgrounds as well, so are knowledgeable about the context and are able to use that as the starting point for dialogue. But we also seek to do a lot of listening and learning before we really begin engaging, as meeting with local leaders, understanding what niche there may be for us to help fill, and not wanting to assume that we could. There have been times in our past, and it's probably true for many organizations, when humility hasn't been our strongest suit, unfortunately, and we're working to change that and to be genuinely humble, respectful, good partners, and working with others towards children's well-being.
Can you give an example of when you feel you didn't have your finest hour? There was a lack of
Sure. Actually, one of the first times, I'll tell you about two, because they were both times when I was working with another agency and came across World Vision. This is when I was with Save the Children. And at first was in Malawi, and we are fortunate. One of our major funding streams in World Vision is child sponsorship, where good people across many countries in the world, including the US, agree to a connection with a particular child and contribute a certain amount per month that goes to support the well-being of that child and other children within the community, and really the whole development approach that I mentioned earlier. And because of that sustainable funding stream, at World Vision in those days, and this was mid-90s, was not attuned to working with others nearly as much as other agencies were. We were pretty self-sufficient and comfortable, shall we say. And so it would make kind of pronouncements and take action without consulting with other agencies, without coordinating even with the government, unfortunately. That's changed through intentionality, and also as resources become increasingly constrained. But fundamentally, because we recognize more so than we have in the past, if we're going to make a greater and more sustained impact in the lives of children, we've got to be working together well with others, the whole range from the government, private sector, other NGOs, et cetera. And I saw a bit of a similar pattern when I was in East Timor as well, kind of starting up SAVE's work there after the post-referendum violence. And again, World Vision as a Big Orange came in and kind of did its own thing and wasn't part of the cluster coordinating mechanism that we should have been. Now, that was years ago, and now we are seeking to be very active collaborators with others, but it's still something we're working on and take seriously.
I guess I have, on the funding side, that's something that really interests me from, I guess, some of the research that I've done here. And I know that last March there was a lot of just discussion within the Christian community because of maybe you can explain the situation better, but about the hiring decision on, I don't know if you want to explain it a little, but on whether or not you were going to start and then continue hiring people of different sexual orientation. Can you speak about that situation a little?
Sure. It was a difficult time for World Vision, and it continues to be in many ways. I think, like the global community and Christian communities across the world as well, there are a range of different perspectives within the World Vision family on same-sex marriage, and different entities have different practices and policies in line with the law within their country, as well as with cultural and historical practices in those countries as well. And it's something we continue to grapple with. World Vision US, the US branch, moved through a time that really inflamed quite a lot of controversy within the core of supporters who are partners and are great, faithful contributors to us. And after what was seen to be a very minor change in employment policy to align with law in the state of Washington, where World Vision happens to be registered. But it was interpreted differently by a lot of folks outside the organization, which led to real questions around how World Vision lives out its Christian identity, and that led to a reversal of that decision. And it's I think our biggest concern in all of this has been that it's taken attention away from the focus on the children who are most vulnerable, who matter most. And it's truly unfortunate. One we hope to have moved through to a better place on now. But I think we're growing, as is the world as a whole, in terms of our understanding of this issue and the dimensions of it.
And so then I guess within that, thinking about that example specifically, how do you, as a faith-based organization, but also like you described as not being super extreme either way, how do you sort of create independent choices and decisions and policies? How do you try and separate that from your funding sources? Or like how do you see the funding influencing policies besides this one example?
Good question. We are fortunate to have fairly diversified revenue streams. I mentioned the different support offices, 18 or so, and have different funding coming from each of those different country contexts, and also a mix in terms of private funding and public funding, or government funding as well, and some streams which are more flexible, others of which are very tied. So in any country where we're operating, we follow the government requirements that are there quite stringently. And then we also consider the interests of the population of that country and of our supporters within that population as well very carefully. And I want to understand where they would like to go. As with any organization, we have to be attuned to both current funders and potential funders, and to think through what will be most compelling for those funders and align that with what is the greatest need on the ground. We wouldn't take funding just to do something that isn't needed and isn't a priority simply because a funder wants to do it. But we do open ourselves to new possibilities and seek to be kind of agile and responsive and think in new ways, especially given how rapidly things are changing in the philanthropic world right now, and look to work in ways that we may not have considered even a few years ago.
Awesome.
Nicole, can I just circle back to the issue on gay marriage? I don't know if many of the people here would necessarily know the facts of the controversy, so maybe you could outline what was changed in the employment policy, why it was changed, who objected, and how the controversy was resolved, if it was resolved, and what controversy continues today.
Helen, I'd be glad to talk about that with anybody who wishes to do so after the session, but I wouldn't
You
want
feel
to go into
constrained
detail right now.
to talk about this?
I think that this isn't really the appropriate setting to go into detail at this time on that.
Fair enough. But I have to ask a follow-on question from that.
Sure.
What can you talk about safely in an open forum? And given that this was a public controversy, what constrains you right now? What there's a party line that you feel you mustn't step over because it's still being worked out behind the scenes, or I'm not pushing you to talk about the specifics. I'm trying to understand what the nature of your constraint is.
Sure. it's a good question that you raise. This is a very challenging issue for many within the World Vision family and many outside the World Vision family as well, with a host of differing perspectives. And it drew in a huge amount of attention and time, both internally as well as externally, to address. Time and attention that was taken away from the work that we seek to focus on the ground. It's an important issue, one we need to take very seriously, but it also is not core to the work that we are seeking to do in most communities around the world. So I think that is why it's one that we're willing to discuss and explore, but not one we want to dwell on or kind of dissect.
Understood. And this is why I'm a lawyer, I suppose. In a faith-based organisation, when there's a values issue that arises upon which there is a range of potential positions, and it's a moment in society when those positions are in a state of flux, what is the World Vision process, the internal process for working through the official outcome on policy? Just the nature of the process. How do you figure it out?
Sure. We do have, as a federation, a number of different voices and perspectives, and certain policy processes in place with the reviews done at different levels according to the nature of the policy as well. This is one where those processes didn't work, where one of our entities acted unilaterally without consultation with the whole of the partnership, and that created issues for the whole of the partnership as well. So it's something we are learning from in terms of leadership and governance, and seeking to improve on moving forward from here. There are other areas in which actually we've been a leader amongst faith organizations as well as other organizations in seeking to address somewhat controversial issues. And I suppose one of the best examples is HIV and AIDS in the early 2000s, when most organizations were really pulling away from that, particularly faith organizations were not interested in touching it. We felt very strongly that it was a huge threat to the well-being of children and families and communities, and that we needed to address that. We needed to overcome those perceptions of those who were living with HIV as somehow sinful, as was the term used in many Christian communities. And I reached back to our core principles of respect for all, of compassion, of love, and to act from that. So I think we are flawed as anyway, I suppose, organization. Maybe we are more flawed than others, but we're seeking to learn and to be faithful as we move forward.
Back to you, Nicole.
Well, I guess I don't want to drag this part out too long, but I completely see where there are many organizational issues that are focused on, like I think CEOs' salaries, for example, are often really focused on in nonprofits and really detract from the actual work that's being done. But like earlier you mentioned that World Vision in the work you do, you don't discriminate based on sexual orientation. So how do you feel like you can carry out the work of protecting homosexual youth when within the organization there's still like not a unified understanding of like whether you're going to accept that within the organization?
Yeah, there is a very legitimate question that you raised there, and there's no easy answer on that. But I think that if we look to another area like ethnicity, for example, that people who are deeply committed to protecting children, no matter their ethnicity, even if they may act out towards adults who have a different ethnicity and other aspects of their lives, can still fulfill their responsibilities and act on their principles in terms of protecting children and young people. And there's a kind of, I suppose there's a cognitive dissonance of sorts that is in play there. it's a tough question that you've raised. I think in principle we are deeply committed to non-discrimination and basis of any aspect of a person's character, including sexual orientation. But in practice, we're still learning fully what that means as gradually more and more young people are able to be open about their sexuality.
Well, thank you for sharing about that. I guess like moving to a completely different topic, another thing that I was really interested in that you brought up earlier was how you guys sort of measure your impact in the community, and how you you said you send out surveys and things like that. And within that, as a faith-based organization, do you include anything about like the way you're going about with your faith or the way that faith is playing out in the work you do? Do you measure that at all?
It's an area we are exploring, and we can't say that we've cracked that particular code as of yet. It's certainly much easier to measure literacy or improvements in nutrition, other things that are more straightforward. We have some draft indicators that we are working with peer agencies on and beginning to test around spiritual nurture, particularly for children, but still very much learning in relation to that. Now, there are other aspects of a kind of a holistic good life for children that are much more straightforward to measure around. Do they feel cared for and protected? Are they participating actively? And are they helping protect one another? Those are more straightforward and pieces we're quite pleased with progress on.
Awesome. Well, I guess we can open it up to the floor if anyone has any questions or wants to comment on anything that Mark has said. Thank you so much for what you've shared with us.
It's a pleasure.
All right, yeah, they'll run around.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Bryson from the Zephyr Institute in Palo Alto. You talked about mobilizing and working with faith leaders. The example you gave was with HIV/AIDS, and you also talked about gender. And I'm interested in this not just from a human rights fairness perspective, but also effectiveness perspective. Leadership in many faith-based communities, formal leadership that has a name and a title is often male, but there are many other forms of leadership and influence from women in these communities. And I'm curious how World Vision handles intersections of considerations of gender and faith leadership, and how to empower and unleash faith communities.
Good, thank you. It's a great question. We feel that gender equality is absolutely essential for the well-being of children and for development of communities more generally. It's something we have actually been working very intensively on over the past several years. Our commitment to gender equality in principle goes back for a couple of decades, but becoming quite intentional around it it's really ramped up over the past several years. And a number of different ways that we are working to address that. One of them is through the Channels of Hope for Gender specifically. It actually focuses on equipping faith community leaders and congregation leaders and members to work to address gender inequality as it's manifest in their particular context. More extreme versions would be domestic violence and gender-based violence of various sorts. There are also a host of other much more subtle but no less significant forms of discrimination as well against women. It's a journey, wanting to be respectful partners and not coming in and saying what you're doing is wrong. We have things to learn as well, and I would even say that within our organization that at the upper echelons of leadership we've made some progress, but we're still not where we need to be in terms of gender equality, and other agencies are significantly farther along than we are in that regard. So part of what we can do is help set an example at all the different levels, including the field level of our organization. We do seek to promote and enable capable women and capable men in key roles. Another approach that we're using is the actual model is called community change, but it's a series of facilitated dialogues with community members, traditional leaders, and others around issues of common concern, digging deeper and deeper into those and understanding the real root causes. And often gender equality is amongst those root causes. No, it's an area we're working quite a lot, but have a very long way to go, needless to say, together with many other allies and partners who are committed to this as well. Thanks.
Yeah. Sorry.
But when you go into, and I don't know if in your position, in your role, if you're positioned to answer this necessarily, but how do you decide where to set down, like what area, what cause, and then in that process, is there any concern with like authorization of attaining some kind of moral legitimacy with regards to the community? Like, is your model kind of like a Good Samaritan model, where I think in that parable, the person's unconscious, so there's an obvious duty to rescue there. But here you're not necessarily dealing with unconscious people, they're agents who have autonomy. So is there any concern with somehow receiving from them authorization? And then going down further from that, if you ever encounter voices that aren't, like, obviously, like, there's the idealized victim that's easy to work with, but then there's also people that, you know, bodily, they might look like a victim, but then once they start speaking and telling stories, it might be a little further from what you have, you know, you think of as a victim. So, like, what happens if you encounter a mother who refuses, you know, doesn't want her child to receive any help with regards to, you know, HIV treatment, or a husband who, within the cultural world he lives in, he thinks it's okay to come home and rape his wife even though he has the AIDS. So how do you deal with voices like that within communities?
Yeah, good insights and good questions. Thank you. At a country level, to start off with, once we are committed to working in a country, then we'd work first with the government, but also with other agencies at a national level that have good insight into where the areas of greatest need are within that country, where there may be niches that aren't filled, where we could play a constructive role. So we'd start with that, and then having received that kind of guidance, then we'd want to go and have initial conversations with key leaders within those parts of the country that were suggested, and to really listen and to understand whether there is a role that we can play, a value that we can add in that space. And again, try to do so humbly and respectfully. Sometimes we're more effective at that regard than others. And then find, together with not just those leaders, but members of the communities, again, what are what's their vision for child well-being, and what are the priorities for moving towards that? How can we contribute towards those priorities? That's kind of the process we would use from a country to a community level. There's also a global process of deciding which countries we'd be working in. We do have a decision-making process in relation to that, especially when emergencies arise. And the humanitarian imperative would compel us to respond when we can, when we have capacity, and when the safety and security issues are such that our staff wouldn't be endangered, or at least would be within manageable risk, to frame it that way. But the individual level questions you're raising are the toughest. I think they're always, we want to see the beauty and the dignity of every individual, and know that all of us have our better times and worse times, and act out of love and of care for each individual. I think that's where it matters most, actually. And our role increasingly is not doing that, not being the Samaritan in place, but equipping the Samaritans, those who are most committed, those who are most capable and understand the situation best. How can we help uplift those local heroes who are really on the front lines of caring for and helping those in need?
I want to jump in with one more question too. So as a Christian organization, but also as someone who, or as an organization that operates within a larger faith-based community, how do you see the Christian aspect of World Vision bringing something different than, say, like a Buddhist organization would, or an Islamic organization? What do you think the difference is there?
Yeah, that's an intriguing question. Certainly, many of us, especially those who are not on the extremes of the spectrum of faith-based organizations, but in between those, share a lot of the same principles, whether we'd frame it in terms of compassion or of love or of calling. Those agencies that are really coming out of a faith-based route to address needs in the world are of the same kind of extended family, I suppose, in many respects. each organization has its own approach to how it shares its faith as well. All those, I would say, that are responsible or have a commitment not to proselytize, never to condition provision of assistance or aid on acceptance of any faith or any belief system, and that we certainly have a strong commitment not to proselytize, not to make any aid conditional in that way. We do seek, when it is appropriate, to share our own faith in ways that others would be may find helpful. And in terms of witness, you could say there is witness in terms of life and deed and word and sign, and the vast majority of our witness in that regard would be in terms of life and deed, how we do our work, and the nature of the work itself. But in context where it's feasible and appropriate, we are, if asked, glad to share as well about what drives us, what motivates us, and our own Christian commitment.
And do you think that that's different than what someone from like an Islamic aid organization would, like, how do you think that's different?
I think it really depends on which organization you're referring to, and because there are different approaches, different takes on this. But I would say it's probably not deeply different in terms of the approach, in terms of the content, the nature of what is shared. It's certainly a bit different. I think most Buddhist organizations would be perhaps less inclined to share in that regard, though there are some that do so. Yeah, I think it really varies depending on the organization.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah, she'll bring you the mic.
So I know we've been talking a bit about controversy in your own organization, and I wanted to talk a bit more about controversy in the faith-based sort of philanthropic organizations as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know a little while ago, I watched a film entitled God Loves Uganda, in which a faith-based religious organization came into Uganda, and it was essentially sponsoring this bill to make homosexuality punishable by death. And it went through, and there was a whole uproar about that. And while I know your group has not done anything similarly dire, I'm just wondering, when you have pressure on your organization by these funders that frequently disagree with some of the values that you share, that you want to propagate throughout the world, like the love and the respect for all people, how do you kind of deal with that when it comes to seeing these other sort of things in the world and addressing them in such a way that you can do what's best both for your funders and your bottom line and for what you think is best? And how would you, what are your thoughts on the film, if you've seen it, or these sort of organizations that have done similar things?
I'm really glad you raised the question. It's a very important one. And we are dismayed by the drive to criminalize homosexuality in Uganda, in other contexts as well, because it just violates our basic principles of love and respect for all people, and our commitment to non-discrimination and all of the work that we do. And we would never accept funding that would be contributing towards advancing that agenda, I would say. Do we engage with organizations that may be sympathetic to that? Yes, we do, because we hope that we can learn together, and perhaps through engagement in some ways, the Holy Spirit can work to bring about a change in mind or heart as well. And it's an area where, again, we want to put children's well-being and interests first, and that of youth as well. And understanding just a bit, having worked quite a bit in Uganda in years past, though I haven't been there in a couple of years, of what children and young people who are gay or lesbian or bisexual must be facing, and the fear that has been created by this movement, it breaks your heart. I hope it's something that can and will be changed over time. Thank you.
Hi. In the same vein as the previous question, are there ever times when the more the religious ideologies of the organization come in conflict with certain strategies that can be used in development and in human aid. I'm thinking specifically maybe for like HIV and AIDS prevention. Is that a problem maybe for the organization as a whole, or for people within the organization, like teaching, certain like safe sex strategies, things like that? Do they ever cause those kind of conflicts?
Yeah, good question. They do. There are those tensions. Helen and I were talking a little bit before about how in aid work there are rarely black and white decision, a yes or no. It's a spectrum in between and lots of shades of gray. Forgive me for using that phrase though this particular week. Moving right along from there. It's interesting, when I was first involved with HIV and AIDS work, one of the most significant positive contributors to addressing HIV and AIDS was the Catholic Church and its different manifestations. They were leaders in home-based care for people living with HIV, for acting out of their sense of compassion and calling, and yet they were adamantly opposed to the use of condoms. And it was one of those conundrums that we just kind of recognized, unlikely to change in the near term, open question in the longer term, I suppose. Likewise, we as an organization grappled with that issue, and I think came to have a version of an approach to prevention that emphasized abstinence and fidelity, but also recognized that condoms were an option in a number of contexts where risks were high. We were not on one end of the extreme or the other. We tried to find a kind of balanced position there. But it is a real tension, and that was another time we had to use a policy process and a lot of internal discussion because it could have put us at significant risk, and in fact did alienate some donors. We were willing to accept that because we believed it was the right thing to do, epidemiologically speaking, and from a spiritual and really a values perspective to protect life. Mm-hmm.
I have two questions. One is organisational and internal to your organisational culture, and the other one is more external. So when you first spoke, you said that you felt that for you, working at World Vision meant that you were working with others where you shared similar motivations. And I know from our discussion prior, I think a couple of weeks ago, you said that it really makes a difference to your workspace, that you know that you're working with others who have the same set of Christian values that you hold. Do you ever worry that that can risk your organisation becoming self-referential, that if you have a pool who are the organisation that come from the same perspective, that you run the risk of having almost an incestuous intellectual process going on, and that just like it needed women to come into the workforce to break open the old boys network, that you need to open up, and that your organisational culture would be a better one if you weren't employing from the same mould. So that's internal. The external one is around the proselytising, and what sort of discussions do you have in the organisation about how you can avoid the subtle form of proselytising, of simply being the source of good things. Most parents want good things for their children, and if they can't supply those good things for themselves, they're going to like the source of the good things. So what sort of internal conversations do you have to avoid that subtle form of proselytisation? How can you be sure that those questions that you say you only respond to when it's a question, how can you be sure that's a question that's coming with true agency, rather than a question that says, well, I want to ensure that the pipeline of good things continues, so I'm going to make sure that the supplier of the pipeline likes me?
Good. Yeah, great questions, Helen. On the first one, there is a real risk of groupthink emerging if too many people come from the same background. One of the reasons I was a bit reluctant to join World Vision when I was approached initially a number of years ago was because my perception from outside was that World Vision did have a lot of people with the very same background and thinking in place, and that my limited encounters had led to that. I was pleased as I began to dig a bit deeper and to have wider conversations to discover that actually there's a quite diverse range of perspectives, both across the Christian community within World Vision, but also beyond as well, as we have staff from different faith backgrounds and different contexts also. And I think that it is important for World Vision to understand our context and to continually inform and challenge one another's perspectives and views. I think it's very positive that we share a few basic values and principles, and I think those, a commitment to the poor, to the vulnerable, to children who are in need, commitment to be, for the most part, humble and respectful, and to work together to make a change. I think all those are positive, and most of those, pardon me? None of those require religion. That's absolutely right. So many organizations would feature those. I think the fact that we have a certain common faith reference point as well, that goes beyond just wanting to do good, but feeling a genuine sense of calling because of our faith, adds an extra dimension of dedication to that from my perspective. I wouldn't want to in any way diminish anyone else's motivation, just saying that it's for us as World Vision, it's very powerful, and generally quite positive. But we have to be aware of the limitations of that as well, and we are continually seeking to enrich that diversity in terms of gender, in terms of national origin, in terms of even age, and in terms of the parts of the Christian community, whether Catholic, Orthodox, the 100 different parts of Protestantism, and various others as well. But it's an ongoing journey and not one I would say we've solved by any means. And in relation to the second question, you're right, there is a risk, despite our commitment not to proselytize, not to ever make aid or support conditional, there is a risk that some could perceive that it is, and therefore want to adopt the religion of the provider of that aid. I think that's a common challenge across all of us as faith-based organizations, whether they're Islamic Relief or Muslim Aid or World Vision or the Salvation Army or Catholic Relief Services or a host of others as well, and one we just have to be vigilant about as well. I think if there's even a glimmer of, well, you maybe get more if you say the right things, that's utterly against humanitarian principles and our own faith commitment, and the way we understand what Christianity means. But it's something we've got to keep working on very hard.
Can you provide an example of in-the-field operations where there's been a concern raised that that exactly that phenomenon has occurred and there's been a rethink? And what I'm trying to understand here is how you get beyond acknowledging that you need to be careful and you need to be respectful and all those. They're all good sentiments, but have you got examples of how on the ground that thought process has led you to change course?
I can't say that a particular incident comes to mind vis-a-vis the proselytizing. There are incidents in relation to food distributing agents, for example, in relief situations, taking advantage of that from unfortunately, a child protection perspective or a gender perspective, but I've not come across many that I'm familiar with in terms of proselytizing, perhaps because it's been such a core principle for us for so long. It's not to say it doesn't occur, but I'm not aware of any recently.
Okay, well, I think we have time for one more, if there's any more questions. Or if not, we can wrap up. Okay.
So from here, I want to thank especially Nicole, who has locked horns. Maybe that's putting it too highly, too aggressively, but has been a wonderful counterpoint to our guest. I want to thank you very much, Mark. you have to understand that when you come here and you subject yourself to the Winter Speaker Series, you have to be willing to gear up. Thank you so much for the perspective, and we're happy to provide you with some sunshine from the cold of the East Coast.
Very much appreciated.
And we'll hope you'll come back, and thank you, Nicole, for being willing to step into the ring of fire. Thanks so much.
Good. Oh, that's great.
Really great.
Thanks,
well
everybody. We'll see you next week.
I'm excited for our dinner too.